I'm Claire O'Neill. I'm the founder of Earthwise Aware, EWA for short, and what we do here at the Growing Center, so that's the Somerville Community Growing Center, is we do some surveys both of plant and their insect, or the insect that visit them. So the first survey that we do is a phenological survey, which means that we study the cycle on the different plants of the garden, and we are especially interested in looking at the native plants. And this garden that you see here is really filled with native plants from maybe 5-6 years ago, started 5-6 years ago. So we follow the seasonal cycle so that we can understand the timing of these different phenomena, and then we also look at the insect on them so that we see what they like, what kind of plants they move from, what kind of plants they feed from, right? And so that we can measure somehow both the abundance, the absence, and the interaction of those insects with the plants. So that's what we do with Earthwise Aware, and we have several sites in the area, but this specific site is a site from the Somerville Community Growing Center. So here in these two beds we are following the native wildflowers here. There is a good variety which gives us, good base for collecting, important data about these plants, how they develop through time, through their cycle, as well as what insect do they host. So for example, here what you have right there, this is an open flowers. This is a purple cornflower. So we follow for this flower both its cycle, its life story, as well as we document all the arthropods, insects and spiders that visit them, right? So we are looking also at this, this one is a brown-eyed Susan, so we follow the cycle. This brown-eyed Susan, for instance, here has a flower. That flower is open because we can see the sexual part of the flowers. So this one is open for business, meaning that it can be pollinated by bees and other insects. So this is a brown-eyed Susan. These you have some kind of flea beans here, and then you have this fantastic plants there as well. So this is a wildflower, this is an aniseisop, and this is something that is very much liked by a lot of beneficial insects there. And it has a long flowering time as well, right? So this is another one that we look at. Here you can see two different kind of milkweed. So you have the common milkweed here, right, with a little fly right on top, which is a condylostylus, little flies. And then here you have another one that is open. Flowers are open. You have the flowers buds as well as open flower, which is another kind of milkweed. This is the butterfly milkweed. This one is at this time you still have open flowers, while this one the flowering time was earlier, and we document that. And right now what you see here as the pods, they are the fruits. They are unripe fruits of this plant. This is they are all very important. This one is important specifically for the caterpillars of the monarch, and monarch, you know that they are endangered, they are decreasing in numbers. So having them in your garden, as well as the other, is very important because the monarch caterpillars feed essentially exclusively on this milkweed species, right? Often people make the mistake, by the way, to only have, let's say, common milkweed or milkweed species. It's important to have the other plants around because the adults do not necessarily just go on milkweed or their flowers, and by the way there is no flowers right now, they go on the flowers of the other wildflowers of this little beds there. So common milkweed, here we have a pass flower of purple cornflowers. Then you have, so you can see, we have really a lot of different plants, a good variety that provide different food for all the insects, which ensure or somehow help with increasing the diversity or the biodiversity of beneficial insect in our cities.
Hi, my name is Paula and I work here at the Growing Center as the site coordinator. And one of the things that has been really important to me is learning about the important ecological benefits that native plants have, and also how they're so important in a city as connector plants for native pollinator species, how even our garden can be so important for the species that are around here, and also overwintering as well. I just want to show you some of the, oh look at, right from the cut flower that I had, we have a little European honeybee here. But a lot of the plants that we have chosen to repopulate the pollinator meadow specifically feed native pollinators, and also a lot of our herbs. So the plants that you see in here, some of these are mini bouquets that we made today, and also some fresh herbs. This is anise hyssop, which is a wonderful plant that native pollinators love that has like a licorice flavor, wonderful in tea. And then we have tulsi, which is a sacred basil. And this may be more of a European herb that we grow in pots, but that we can cut and use. But this is definitely, the hyssop is a wonderful native plant to have in the garden. And then in some of our wildflower bouquets, you can see that we have some native grasses and some flowers here, the cone flowers, a brown-eyed Susan, and then also some blue mist flower, some goldenrod, and some of the fleetblings that Claire talked about that are really important to native pollinators. And what we do is we have a lot of native plants in more than one area in the garden, but we also need to maintain access to the pathways. So sometimes we do some cutting or selective cutting of some of the native plants, and then we can use them by sharing them in bouquets or sharing herbs with community members.
So here, one of the activity, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is to look at insects, beneficial insects. And here, looking at this little patch of Rudbeckia here, coneflowers, the specific coneflowers, as well as the big one. We are recording the activity of the bees, the many different bees that are on this little patch there. So we look at the interaction. Usually the interaction is that they are foraging, either collecting nectar or pollen on the flower. And we take records of that, a few pictures, so that we can identify these bees. So for example, this one is likely to be a common eastern bumblebee. This little one that is about 15 millimeters is in this area. So often what we have is brown-belted bumblebee, common eastern bumblebee. We also have little sweat bees, and then we have other insects such as butterflies, moths, etc. So Christian is going to tell you a little bit more about what we are doing with Buggy and the importance of recording interactions of insect and their host plant.
All right, so we want to take pictures of insect plant associations, and we're of course really interested in native plants because native plants are better for supporting native pollinators like native bumblebees and other specialist bees like sweat bees, mason bees, leafcutter bees. And so the idea is that we need to have native plants that have co-evolved with these insect pollinators and other insects as well. A lot of them are important host plants for the caterpillars, and then of course also important nectar sources for a lot of our pollinators, particularly our native pollinators. And so we definitely want to promote native pollinators throughout the area. So you have different kind of quote-unquote islands of habitat. They can fly from one area to the next. And of course a lot of people have just grass lawns which do not support biodiversity and do not help our native pollinators and other beneficial insects. So we really do want to promote the native plants. And of course another benefit of native plants is that they of course are adapted to the local environment, so they usually don't need any fertilizers, they don't need any excess watering, and so it can help homeowners conserve water, not use pesticides, not use fertilizers, and then of course support native biodiversity, particularly our beneficial insects.
So to conclude this little portion here, I want to reiterate the importance of native plants in cities. So a little stat, I'm a statistician by the way originally, is that 4.3 billion of the population, the worldwide population, are living in cities. This is about 55% of the world, the world population. By 2050, it's going to reach about 70%, right? 70% of all the world population will be in cities. So the cities, by the way, urban sprawl is real. This landscape is a very hard landscape from a nature standpoint. There is too much hard surface, dark surfaces, meaning that it's a heat trap. To a point where some countries try now to paint their street into light color to reflect the sun and all these kind of things. But greening our cities is going to be very important. Having gardens like this one filled with native plants that ensures somehow some corridor paths for all beneficial insects, and it also allows insects that were not in cities in the past decade to come back to this area. So this is very important because it helps mitigating the global biodiversity loss worldwide. Another thing that I want to mention is what we do at EWA, at Earthwise Aware, meaning to document, to study the interaction between plant and their insect, as well as other, mammals, birds, etc. This is critical. Why? Because those 50%, 55% of the population in cities are not connected with nature. By doing studies like that, what we do is we make people experience that, to experience their environment, and to make them realize the gravity of the issue worldwide, the biodiversity loss and the loss of insects, for example. And it also gives them hope and tools so that they can better remediate and tackle those issues. So this is somehow what I wanted to say. The importance of native space like that for our insect is critical. So join us.
Pull that out.
Hi, I'm Bill Bennett, and this is...
I'm Jonathan Rich.
We moved into Somerville about 27 years ago and found this house to buy about 25 years ago. The place turned us into gardeners. We weren't before, and actually joining a Somerville Garden Club tour of gardens around Somerville got us started. Eventually we joined the Somerville Garden Club. Jonathan's wearing the t-shirt, and in our own time each of us has been a president of the garden club. We've been involved with the annual garden club sales and with the evolving culture of the garden club. When we moved in, the place where we were sitting was nothing like it is now. There was the remains of an old garage where I'm sitting. The rest of the earth was essentially barren, partly because weed maple trees, Norway maple trees, exotic invasives, had seeded themselves in nearby and were basically sucking the life force out of the soil. So we had a job in the first couple of years of figuring out how to get rid of the remains of the old garage, the concrete block, and it was actually Jonathan who created a design for the yard, and he had very clear ideas about the importance of form in a small garden.
Some of which I guess we got from the garden club. I remember it was a garden club lecture about where someone was suggesting having a garden at different levels.
And with different rooms, different compartments.
Yeah, that got me doing that. But also I had a thing about English gardens in small city spaces. I felt like you should have straight lines in a city garden. That's just my
not like English gardens that are all about wavy, naturalistic lines. Yeah. But this is very much a garden in transition. Our ideas about a garden have changed. The things we planted have changed, so that where at one time we could have hollyhocks, which require full sun and are not native, we now have a lot of shade, and we're moving toward native plants for a very important reason, that native plants actually support insect life, and insect life supports bird life, and both insects and birds, their populations in America are crashing. They're crashing for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that land which at one time would have supported native plants that the insects recognize has been replanted with things that they simply don't know how to eat or that would be toxic to them. Why does that matter? Well, you know a lot about pollinators probably. They're around in the daytime. In the nighttime, moths are important, and there are all kinds of them. There are lots of species, some quite elegant, some mostly small and brown, but they have caterpillars. Caterpillars are the larvae of moths, and birds are utterly dependent on caterpillars. a nest of hatchlings, to say of black-capped chickadees, requires 7,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make it through the first few days of life. After that, they can start to eat other things, but the protein and fat of the caterpillar is crucial. And then the birds in turn, of course, relate to a larger ecosystem. A lot of the traditional form of gardening, the kind that landscapers put in and that nurseries like to sell, are about as useful as plastic for living creatures. I find when I walk by lots of yards, there's no life. You don't see anything buzzing, you don't see anything fluttering. And that's kind of our aim here. It's a long shot, it'll take a while, and we're old for that, but we're on the way. Traditionally, what people want from a garden is plants that look perfect with no blemishes or flaws in them. Our aesthetic is changing so that we're hoping to see plants with small amounts of damage. And here's an example of the difference between a native plant and one that's been imported. The one down here that I'm pointing to is called Canadian wild ginger. It's a kind of ground cover, and if you notice, it's got little holes and chomps and bites taken out of it. That now is something we're looking for. Whereas over here behind Jonathan, there's the European cousin of that plant. It's in the same genus, and if you get closer and look, well, actually I can see one chomp for some reason, but basically this is pristine, meaning that it has played no part in the ecology of this little patch of earth. One thing about gardening with native plants is that often you get little surprises. These are two jewelweed plants. I didn't plant either of them here. A friend gave me a division that was planted over there. These seeded themselves in. They're annuals. They're familiar New England plants. They like a fairly wet foot, so this summer has been great for them. They're famous because their little seed pods will pop and send seeds all over. So next year we'll have jewelweeds somewhere. I have no idea why, but that's part of what growing native plants is about, is putting up with the unexpected locations and arrivals and being willing to enjoy a little bit of mess. This one happens to be all intertwined with an American spikenard, which is now looking kind of raggedy because the birds have been eating the berries that this plant makes. I don't find them terribly tasty, but the birds love them, and so they're enjoying them right now. In their prime, they form a nice kind of rounded shrub, although they're perennials. They'll die back every year and come back. I've got a couple of them here. Totally native, raggedy ass right now, but very much supporting bird life.
We were in France in, I've forgotten exactly the year, 15 years ago, and stopped one afternoon at a chateau that we'd seen in our guidebooks, and they stopped us at the gate and said, well, the chateau is closed now. I said, well, we're really more interested in the gardens than in the chateau. And so they said, well, okay. And then we're poking around, this lady comes out, and it turns out she's the chatelaine, and she was curious that someone would come just to see the garden. But what they had was that this was an incredibly formal European garden with the edges of every square bed were boxwoods that looked like they'd been trimmed with manicure scissors, with the whole field of it being lavender. So we came back and tried that in our front yard, which was the only place that had enough sun for this. And it didn't work out so well. For one thing, the boxwoods you really have to keep after to keep them in shape. And they didn't winter very well here. It was too cold for them.
They wintered terribly.
Yeah, they wintered terribly. And I see more or less the same with the lavender. It lasted a couple of years and then they went kaput. So it was just one of 3 or 4 different iterations that the front beds have had. We kept trying things and they kept dying. And now we have a sort of pleasant chaos out there, I would say.
Well, we made a virtue of failure and completely changed the sensibility of the front yard. Here at the front of the house, we had the opportunity to plant things that thrive in full sun. Growing any garden, but certainly our experience with native plants has been very experimental, and like all experiments, there are either failures or the unexpected. One of those was this plant, which came in fairly small. It's a senna, wild senna it's called. It is the favored plant of a blue butterfly that is endangered in New England. And this plant exists almost nowhere in the wild now in Massachusetts. So we thought, you know, what the hell, we'll have a senna in the front yard. It's kind of taken over. And so I suspect...
Nobody said 8 feet.
Yeah. So I suspect that it'll have to either be subjected to some discipline and bondage or simply removed. One of the great American gardeners said at one point, to have a good garden you need to kill a lot of plants. Here we've got a mix of things we intended and things we didn't intend. Doing well or poorly as they come along. This is another goldenrod. It'll shortly have a big sort of fountain of yellow flowers. Down here, struggling, is a New England aster, which was intentional. That is not the struggling part, but the aster. It's flopping against a bleeding heart that is native and volunteered there. And I have no idea what this is. It just showed up. I hope it's native, and I kind of like it. But this is, again, the sort of chaos that we have. There's a blueberry here. We're struggling for that, and I boasted about its fall color. There's one tiny leaf down there that has fall color. But, you know, you kind of roll with the punches and the agreement or disagreement of the plants you're trying to grow.